Hi everyone, welcome to Spinnaker's webinar, Outside In from the Inside Out, the real work of becoming demand-driven. You can submit a question through the Q&A box on the lower left-hand side of your screen. Simply type your message and click Enter. If you should require assistance throughout the conference, please press *0 on your telephone keypad to reach a live operator. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Paul Adamson. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike, and good day, everyone. Sorry about a little bit of the technical difficulties, but you will not miss out on any of the great conversation today. As Mike said, my name is Paul Adamson. I lead the marketing and business development teams for Spinnaker. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's joint webinar with Spinnaker, Supply Chain Insights, and SanDisk, titled Outside In from the Inside Out, the real work of becoming demand-driven. Today's webinar brings three supply chain fanatics together to talk about the benefits and challenges of becoming demand-driven. Our speakers today are Lora Cecere from Supply Chain Insights, Shiva Esturi from SanDisk, and John Bouff from Spinnaker. The goal of today's webinar is not to educate you on demand-driven, but rather to share insights on what the journey looks like. It's not simple, it's not easy, and for many, it's not even intuitive when you get into what really has to change inside a company. Today we're going to sort through the skeletons that exist in everyone's closet while we, 1, discuss what demand-driven makes different, 2, understand the obstacles that exist in organizational and personal misalignment, and 3, provide you with real-world examples to help you knock down the barriers to becoming demand-driven. A couple block and tackle items. These slides will be available on the Spinnaker website and our LinkedIn groups. In addition, you can find more information on the Supply Chain Insights website. We will have time for Q&A at the conclusion, but don't hesitate to queue up your questions at any time by typing them in the Q&A box on the display to your left. We'll address questions at the end, obviously time dependent. Finally, thank you again for joining. It's now my pleasure to introduce John Bouff, Vice President of Spinnaker's Management Consulting Practice and a passionate advocate of reality-based consulting. John?
Thanks, Paul. This is John Bouff. I lead the management consulting side at Spinnaker, where we focus on supply chain strategy and leading practice adoption for clients in a range of industries. Today, this discussion is very interesting to us because in the course of our work, we constantly find that the hardest parts of successful supply chain improvement are much more about the organizational and individual changes that need to happen rather than the theories or the best practices themselves. In several decades of pursuing supply chain transformation, I've learned that this is actually core rather than a sideband activity, and Spinnaker orients its supply chain practice to really kind of tackle this essential truth. We have a participant here today who can speak firsthand about the practical experiences of trying to do big things. Shiva?
Thanks, John. I am Shiva Esturi from SanDisk Corporation, and I am responsible for supply chain optimization. And it has been exciting at SanDisk to go through this journey of making the supply chain adaptive. I've been with SanDisk for the last 10 years, and we'll talk more about in the rest of the conversation. Back to you, Laura.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to join John and Shiva today to talk about the journey to become demand-driven. Let's start with my journey. You know, as I have become an analyst and I study the evolution of demand-driven, you know, the first thing that I had to come to grips with is what is demand. And as a practitioner, I had worked in many supply chains for companies like Kraft, Procter & Gamble, Clorox, and I had believed that demand was an order. And I'd also believed that demand was making a forecast better. And one of the issues is that is not the basis of becoming demand-driven. Instead, what we have to do is we have to embrace demand translation across the value network. This is a representation of the consumer value network. But what has happened is as we translate demand across the levels of the value network, we distort and amplify the demand in the bullwhip effect. Now, over the last 10 years, what I've seen are three trends. One, the supply chain has become more complex, so there are more tiers. Secondly, forecast variability has increased, so it is more difficult to use conventional techniques. And third, we cannot get here through an evolution of 1990s practices. Instead, this is a step change for us to rewire our brains to think not only about the translation of demand against the tiers of the supply chain, but also to think about concepts like demand sensing, which is using channel data and outside-in processes to translate demand and less dependency on orders, to really embrace demand shaping, which is price management, incentives, and product life cycles, and also to be able to look at demand translation to be able to decrease distortion. It requires a real hand on both the redesign of demand and the redesign of supply, which is why I think the SanDisk case study is so powerful. If we go to the next slide, one of the things that happens in the market when people begin their demand-driven paradigm is they have to define what does demand-driven mean. And so in 2006, when I had been a Gartner analyst and I became an AMR research analyst, I was struggling with the definitions of demand-driven. And at AMR Research, we had started with the consumer-driven supply networks definition that was defined by Procter & Gamble in the 1990s, which was a shelf-driven outside-in process really looking at 2 moments of truth. And this concept of 2 moments of truth is a very powerful one. Procter & Gamble said that they would be successful if the product was available when the customer wanted it, and when the customer bought it, they were delighted. Those were the 2 moments of truth. So one of the identification or definition elements of demand-driven strategies is getting really clear on your moments of truth. The second thing is, as we look at the evolution of demand-driven and the definitions, in 2004 we looked at sensing and translation. And the traditional supply chain does not sense, it responds. It's designed to be very efficient, and a tightly integrated supply chain cannot sense, and it cannot be outside in. And then as we migrated from the supply networks definition to the value network concept, where we're now dealing with a value network, not just the enterprise, but a value network. And unfortunately, most value networks are held together with Excel spreadsheets and email, which has latency associated with it and does not allow for the translation of demand. The building of value networks is an important element to this. When I wrote my book, Bricks Matter and Market-Driven Metrics That Matter, I took it one step further and said, this can't just be about demand, it also has to be about supply, and that we need to orchestrate demand, probability, and volatility, sense and translate and orchestrate across the value network and horizontal processes bidirectionally. And that's, I think, what SanDisk has really worked on. The journey to become demand-driven or market-driven is not something that happens with the snap of the fingers or overnight. I find that it typically is a multi-year journey which requires a real cultural and leadership redefinition. So with that, let's get into the case study. The implications for the company on this demand-driven journey are really very, very fundamental. I mean, it requires us to rethink the basics of what is supply chain excellence. And it requires us to look at a program and a roadmap to go forward and abandon more functional or project-based approaches, because this is a different way of thinking about the supply chain outside in. You recognize that it's not about just better forecasting, and it's not about just better management of the order, but it's really about embracing channel demand outside in from the channel back across the tiers of the supply chain, while implementing new techniques to manage supply to be able to become more agile through buffers and form and function of inventory, and getting better at the synchronization, not the integration, the synchronization of the demand signal. So that's what I think is different. Let's get into the case study. John, let's talk and tee it up a little bit.
So I really like your comment about rewiring the brain, because when you look at step changes, but if you look at how most companies engage the activity they do other than their day-to-day, that really doesn't rise to that level. And in this case, they're taking a path, and Shiva will point this out in a couple places, that touches everyone somehow. but the implications of that really don't always register at the outset, and sometimes the company basically underestimates the scope and the scale and the nature of the change. For one thing, demand-driven is actually counter to a lot of conventional wisdom that is baked into a lot of companies. You've got long-time employees that have been around for a while, they've been around the block, and they have that attitude, especially when it comes to once a quarter having to meet the number, because a whole bunch of common sense gets compartmentalized at the last few weeks of the quarter in pursuit of a goal that is anything but demand-driven. And it's also a very exacting discipline, and a lot of people who are established in the status quo will find themselves not quite feeling as confident or as qualified when they're asked to do new things in a much more demanding way. And we're going to talk about this too, because inside companies, it's made up of people, and those individual fiefdoms and perks do exist. And sometimes they are institutionalized by the way the company operates and rewards its people. And so in order to make changes that go across the various functions, you really need to touch on those systems that encourage people to behave inside those functions. So Shiva, I mean, this is your time to really talk about what this really looked like for SanDisk over a period of time. So why don't you give us a few pointers?
Thanks, John and Laura. The first, briefly about SanDisk, everything we do is around flash memory solutions, and we enable innovations in 4 mega markets. The one is the enterprise market in the data center, the client computing, all the SSDs that you see in the ultrabooks, and mobile and connected devices in the smartphones and the tablets, and consumer products. That's at a high-level view of SanDisk. The next the slide, we talk about the supply chain structure. Just to give the 10,000-foot view of the supply chain view of SanDisk, starting from the right, we have a wafer fabrication with joint partnership with Toshiba, and together we produce almost close to 50% of the world's output of memory. And then the back-end manufacturing includes the memory packaging, test, the card assembly, packaging and test, and also drive assembly and test. And we have our own factories in Malaysia and in Shanghai, and we also leverage and depend heavily on the CMs who specialize in different areas of manufacturing. And our market is both retail and OEM, around 65-35 split. And the retail, you can find our products in around 300,000 plus storefronts, and the OEM through the hubs, channel, distributor, and all. It's a scalable and vertically integrated manufacturing. We ship around 2 million units daily through this chain. And few key consideration in semiconductor industry in general, and more predominant for SanDisk, it's wafer fabrication is long lead time. And this is typically we have to build to the forecast. And then the few number of wafers turns out to be thousands or tens of thousands of products at the finished goods level. And with that, I'll just walk you through the journey of the overall supply chain, or the adaptive supply chain, in the next slide. Here, just to give the background of this slide, the bars in the bottom shows our shipments in petabytes, the projected over time, and the blue line is inventory turns, and the red dotted line is the service level metric. So going back in time, we had enabled our advanced planning solutions systems back in 2006. In around 2007 time frame or before, the flash is a constrained substance in the market. So pretty much anything we build, there is a market to consume it. And as the flash industry matured, and into around 2008 time frame, typically all the semiconductor industry goes to the supply-demand balance and changes, which is seasonal and cyclical. And in around 2008 scenario where the supply was available in excess of the demand, the market demand across the industry, and the customer obviously had choices, and then it's no longer the constrained commodity that it used to be. And the 2008, the industry saw huge inventory in the supply chain. And and also the one more dimension of this memory is we cut the cost significantly, almost the 50% somewhere around a year every year. So the inventory depreciates a lot. So in 2008, so we saw a low inventory turn, at the same time having the products that's not wanted by the customer. So this is around the change. It came top down, where our management, the CEO and the president of the company, has started orchestrated the entire organization to reverse the trend of increasing the inventory and reducing the service level. So this is the first stage. What I'm referring to is the postponement strategy. Here we did few fundamental changes to how we operate. This is one of the major change in the supply chain, and then after that the rest of the journey became an incremental re-engineering after once we had the initial change. And this change is more the supply side actually. The key changes are, first, we reduced the manufacturing frozen fence, which used to be 8 to 9 weeks to a week. Now it is less than a week. And we implemented the concept of multi-stage the inventory. As opposed to building the forecast to the finished goods, we staged the inventory across the pipeline, giving rise to the push-pull process as opposed to just push before. And then also, we focused heavily on the demand signal. We have a forecast, and then we have the supply, the manufacturing that's meeting the demand. In between, we defined a demand signal for manufacturing. And this demand signal composes of isolating the events, promotions, the seasonal factor, or high-risk demand signal, and the run rate signal. And so and we treat these demand signals differently, and we buffer the run rate, not the events. So those are some of the changes done to the demand signal. And this was we started seeing the results immediately in terms of the inventory turns. As you can see, from 2009 January when we implemented this, the inventory turns kept growing up. So one thing I want to also talk about here is we formed a kind of a think tank team. We'll talk about it more later. And this team helped design the solution, the what should be the future solution, and that's what we marched towards implementing. At this time, we were just made some assumptions. What should be the inventory level? We made certain rule of thumbs, and then as this process is matured, we implemented this multi-echelon inventory optimization, where bringing in the outside-in approach, looking into the customer requirement and accordingly multi-staging the inventory. And we saw a good improvement in the inventory turns while improving the service level. As we learned more about the demand and the customers, and the source of inspiration is from different ports internally within the SanDisk, from the customers, from the BUs or the sales and marketing teams. We evolved towards incremental re-engineering of segmenting the supply chain by product and customers. So we offer 8 to 10 variations of the segment of supply chain, which may vary dynamically by customer and product. And also at this time, as things are evolving, the policies changes, the rules changed. So we developed this supply chain center of excellence team, so that to keep all the things in checks and balances. And also customer focus team, the teams to focus on the CPFR team. And then we also initiate the customer operations management team, so which is bringing all the outside-in information to our supply chain, which had been very responsive.
Hey, Shiva, did you find that going to the fixing some of the core supply things, the postponement and the echelon deployment, bought you some credibility when you went to go engage the customer and sales teams and perhaps propose some things that were maybe novel to them?
Yeah, it's a good question, John. And here, again, before when we were building to forecast and we had wrong inventory in the wrong place, the credibility of the operations has been not very high. And the postponement strategy, the overall supply chain team, once we did this a change, radical shift in the way how we think and operate. So this gained credibility internally across different organizations. And the directive from our COO is the improving the terms across the value chain, even the channel and the distribution. And once our customers saw that we were able to deliver or turn around the inventory faster, and it gained some credibility to engage some of our key customers, especially the consigned customers, and then improve the terms in the channel. And then that set a new benchmark for many of our other customers as well. And the same journey expanded to some of the e-tailers as the e-tailers started evolving. Then we had a value chain integration with close collaboration with the e-tailers who have real-time information with respect to out of stock and these kind of things that we could tightly integrate with our supply chain.
So let me ask you a question, because there are three elements of this journey that I think are really remarkable that people that may not be following this as closely may not see it firsthand. First of all, the number of years that you've been at it. It's very rare for a company to be able to continue the evolution of this roadmap for multiple years. And secondly, the evolution of the center of excellence. 50% of companies fail, and only 5% have really implemented multi-tier inventory optimization. Culturally, how did you go about it, and how were you able to sustain this roadmap for that period of time?
Actually, as we started progressing towards this journey, the teams evolved and the roles changed and the responsibilities changed, and as we learned more and more, some of these things automatically happened. The first thing is the supply chain center of excellence. So this is as we implemented this the complicated process and the systems, then there has to be a different set of skill set to understand all these processes and the systems that tightly integrate that need to be evolved. So we started this the supply chain center of excellence more playing a role that maintains and keeps this engine running constantly. And that team, it started with maybe initially one person, and then it evolved. Now we have, between the supply chain center of excellence and analytics center of excellence, we have around 10 people leading the changes across the company.
How would you characterize the DNA? You said the culture had to change. What about it had to change?
It's actually the some of the things, when we started this journey, I mentioned about the think tank team. It initially it was a blend of the small core team, and we had a IT team participating, and also we had a few voluntary teams from different functional experts. They also participated and contributed in this thinking process. So some of this the change, this think tank team automatically had the complete thought process, and then they helped deploy change. And it took a while for everyone across the organization to adapt the change. But initial change was big bang, and then the change across the organization, it evolved over time, which made it easy for the next steps.
So we've got a question from our audience. Some of the policy changes that you actually had to implement, what did you face in terms of the implementation challenges and service levels, as you get into more of that synchronization between supply, demand, and product?
Yeah, that's a good segue to my next section, which I put this the previous slide on the allocation to maximize the dollar per GB. So think of that. What I meant to show there is a supply chain as a pipeline. When the supply and demand scenario is balanced, like we operate on like certain inventory levels and the service level and the turns. When we get into a supply constraint scenario, think of it tilting the supply chain upwards, where the demand certainty drives pulls the supply to the demand. And the other way to think when we have excess supply, tilting the supply chain downwards, where like we offer shorter lead time to the customers and create more market to our products. And this changes. This is very dynamic. For at any point of time, a small segment of the market may be constrained, or a particular wafer technology is constrained. So we had to balance this lever across the different supply and demand scenarios, and which is dynamic. Historically, like some of these decisions are made by head of operations or with the conventional wisdom and knowledge of the business and the supply scenario. And given this, like these were like systematic and more data driven. So we set up we put a governing entity around the supply chain policy. So this tilting of the supply chain, all the levers that need to happen, like when it is a supply constraint, like doing a expedited shipment, or like operating at a lower level of targets, or all these different changes that happens across the supply chain is governed by the supply chain policies. And like the supply chain center of excellence, as the supply chain matured, there's like we put like analytics framework around these policies, and that gave rise to the analytics center of excellence, who is primarily like think of it as a supply chain R&D group, who is like predominantly looking into all the different options and trade-offs and recommending the best option. And the best option will become a policy for our systems and the processes. So that's to answer your question. That's how we controlled the policy across the chain.
And what you're observing, the lens is on the entire value chain, right? Not just on internal operations. Yes. And so your definition of being out of balance, supply or demand constrained, really is looking kind of end to end. And now it sounds like you managed to get it started and then progressively build a lot more factual analysis into the decision process around it too.
That's right. That's right, John. Like as we started from the supply side and integrated the demand side within our company boundaries, and then expanded to the entire value chain. And then now the supply chain center of excellence or the analytics team is looking to the entire value chain and accordingly setting up the policies. That's also, if you see the curve, like after 2011, where like these policies, we could have an effective balance between the service level and the inventory turns, and then like we could achieve, like we could clearly define what is the inventory level range that we want to operate in, and what is the service level range we have to operate in, and we could effectively balance the overall supply chain.
Okay.
And one more dimension to add is the product dimension, like we're engineering the product to get like the maximum benefit of the chain. And that gives a segue to the change management. Actually, this evolved over time, and it's just a consolidated view. And the John Sharkey from Spinnaker worked with SanDisk. He tried to compile this slide for me, which is which looking backward, it was like pretty. It encapsulated all the journey that we went through. Just like I'll call out on few things from our journey. The bottom one on the skilled resources, like a small core team, that's about the think tank team that we formed, I think, which is a great success in the change management. So this small team of different functional group leads who participated in the design of the solution, they played a major role in deploying the change across their organization. And the second on the metrics, the things evolved over time. Like it started with inventory turns metrics, then customer service level metrics, and then the where we are now is all our internal metrics are good, all our goals are based on the customer scorecards. It doesn't matter what we think, how we did, how is our customer thinking, how we are doing. So that's a bigger shift across the organization and the evolution of the metrics that changed. And then also you can see under shared vision, the cross-functional communication meetings and the workshop. Even now, it's no longer an operations or a manufacturing function. Some of these policies and it impacts the end-to-end, how the sales communicates to the customer and how we position the inventory, how the manufacturing responds, and the entire chain. So we have this cross-functional meetings and workshops, the recurring meetings that goes through the entire view of the supply chain, and we discuss more on the cross-functional alignment decisions as opposed to the issues in those discussions. Then the few other things, the sell-through and inventory metrics, more emphasis for the sales side, and also some of the, we did talk about engaging some of our key retail customers and the value chain. We did work with some of the retailers, and then new markets, we are trying to engage with the customers, understanding those markets and trying to get the outside in information. And I mentioned about the customer operations management team, who plays who is a part of the operations wing, but very closely intact with the sales and the customer team to get this outside in information.
So, I'm just going to go through a couple of skeletons and highlight, some of the things I think are really embedded in a wonderful journey. And thank you for sharing. As we think about the supply chain, we've got non-linear relationships between the metrics. And I see many people measuring way too many things and not really being aligned on the metrics that matter. And inventory matters, right? Form and function of inventory, really looking at the role of inventory as we become demand-driven, but also managing those cycles around our lead times and really getting the rhythm and cycle right with the inventory. And the tension between cost and profitability in those cycles is something we've got to design. And I really commend you for really embracing that design as you've gone through incredible growth. What many companies get bogged down in is rise in complexity without really managing complexity. And so, I also commend you for bringing in that product side to be able to look at complexity and management of the item master. So job well done. I think the metrics that matter, we've really got to stay focused that it's a non-linear complex system that's got to be balanced and managed holistically and designed. The second thing that I think is really a barrier to being able to do that is the fact that our traditional processes, the SCORE methodology, the APIX methodology, really embrace a functional organization that can't do that. So we often see that a manufacturing organization is very focused on return on assets, which will throw the supply chain out of balance and not allow us to really manage form and function of inventory. We often will see a procurement organization really focused on the lowest cost of procurement, which will also throw the supply chain out of balance. Or we'll see a logistics organization that wants to fill up every truck. And so those are very much about efficiency. And as we think about the demand-driven journey, we need to be able to orchestrate in a center of excellence like you're talking about. I liken it to running a decathlon, right? So the orchestration of these functions, I've got to be able to have set points to help them to rationalize, but I've also got to help them to say, I am not going to be the best in each function. I'm going to align my metrics that matter to be able to orchestrate across supply and demand. And that's hard work and really requires good planning and good centers of excellence, but we've got to throw away our traditional concepts. The other thing that I think we've got to do is we've got to really abandon the fact that we can't get there with a project-based focus. I have a number of companies who start on demand-driven projects, and they become like science projects. I visit them today, and they're doing Project X, and then they're doing 1,000 Projects Y. And as we look at sustaining the evolution, it's very difficult in a project-based environment. We can't just assume that project A plus project B, because it meets a return on investment, is going to give us progress at the intersection of these metrics. So when we look across the industry, we see that 9 out of 10 companies are stuck, and that most companies only make progress for a very short-term period at the intersection of inventory turns and cost, because they have a more project-based thought. Now, John, those are my thoughts. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think those are two of the most fundamental ones. And back to the metrics, it's the corporate dashboard often looks imbalanced at the corporate level. But as it descends into the organization, it starts to split up, and it creates really unhealthy tensions in local behaviors where you stand back and look from the board level and think that must be fine, but internally operating, they haven't chosen to do that. You know, Swami, one of the things I wanted to ask you was, as you changed your market focus, or Shiva, I'm sorry, it's really common that how people are compensated in a very minute way using very specific metrics can distort the whole thing and really be an impediment, you know, to progress. Did anything like that happen during, I mean, did the sales compensation plan or model change during this transition? Because if it hadn't, you're still going to have people who are trying to hit their quarter-end numbers and who are motivated by things that you wouldn't call demand-driven.
Yeah, the overall, like, again, the localized metrics changed to the overall, right, like the cross, in the previous slide on the cross-functional vision. And we share the common goals and the common vision. Just to give one example, like the logistics metric is no longer the logistics cost. When we do the effective trade-off, like maybe like in certain scenarios when the memory is constrained, we expect everything to be expedited shipment. Yeah. So the cost of logistics will outweigh the overall, like the benefits that we get from the having the memory available for the customer with this incremental cost.
And if you didn't have alignment that was okay, everybody would be pointing out, you know, look at those logistics costs, right? Those guys are crazy, right? But because it's okay to air freight or to accelerate because it's part of the plan, then you can orchestrate to be able to deliver that.
And which is dictated by these policies, controlled at a like central level, so which helps to get the balances. And yeah, and the sales incentive is more like the focus towards sell-through, right, as opposed to sell-in. So some of those changes obviously have a the positive impact.
So let's spend a minute talking about sell-through versus sell-in. This is an important concept because when I speak, I talk about this as one of the elements I look for demand-driven, and people scratch their head and say, what does that mean? And, you know, when we focus on sell-through, we focus all the way to the end consumer, right? And we change the sales incentives to do that. And most sales teams are rewarded when they stuff the next partner's warehouse, right? And that creates distortion. And so this is a very big change management issue. How did you go about it?
It's like I was not part of like many of these changes, but again, it's more of the top-down initiative across the organization to be more the inventory and customer focus. And which drove like some of these actions, and the historically SanDisk has been always like sell-through focused as opposed to sell-in. So it was like except for the companies that we integrated over time, there's been some change management.
But it requires that leadership element, right, that says that this is what we're going to reward. So kudos, good job, well done.
Well, they baked it in all the way to the CFO because they started doing revenue recognition at the point of sell-through too.
Right.
So nobody had clean hands if they stuffed the channel. So some of the other stuff, and just to go briefly, talk about a project focus. SanDisk put up a COE that oversaw a lot of that, but in many companies, the projects are devolved to a set of practitioners who really haven't been part of this conversation and really don't have the awareness or sometimes the sense of empowerment to go pursue something new, and they end up doing what they know. And there's a lot of local distortions that happen when you fragment the activities and you don't have some adult supervision like the Center of Excellence to do that. And quite honestly, SanDisk started with a vision and operating model objective, and then they did the tools. And we see sometimes not quite that sequence, and the tools start out and they get over the front of their skis with what they think automation will do when they really haven't thought how they're going to operate.
Well, but the secret is that, the way that the technology market works is consultants and technologists want to sell tools, and so often that's the sexy stuff, but the hard stuff is really the fiber and the culture.
Yeah. I think the other real key about what can really happen and what has to be under your microscope is that, as Swami and Lora both said, it's a value chain. Shiva and Lora both said, it's a value chain issue. SanDisk metrics look at the value chain for them to detect when it's time to do a policy change. Some of your supply and customer base isn't always as ready, and sometimes your change management has to do outreach and engage with your trading partners to bring them along with you.
Yeah, John, like that gives a segue to the question that one of the audience has about the CPF of our process. How do we manage this process with a shorter time frame? So that's the journey towards the customer segmentation. When we we moved from one-size-fits-all approach where building to a forecast to building to a multi-staging the inventory or postponement strategy. And from there, as we learned more and more about these customers and the segments, the CPF for customers, primarily they collaborate the demand 13 weeks in advance, and then they expect us to have the material and when the week 13 becomes current week. So here, we created a separate segment of the supply chain, and on a weekly basis, we do collaborate the demand based on the sell-through information with the customers. And based on the changes, the supply chain reacts. If the demand goes away, then automatically if we haven't started the WIP, we will stop it and repurpose it for something else. And alternatively, if the demand goes up and somewhere else it goes down, then we could readjust and try to meet the customer expectation. So we introduced this demand layer called commits, and then this commits for the supply chain is treated like a customer order, and it creates some reservation to the supply, to the entire supply. And when we start the build, it is controlled based on the lead time. And that's how we were able to manage the reduced time spans complemented us doing better in these segments of the customer segment as well.
So in your business, Shiva, especially on the supply side, there's a little bit of a win-lose mentality between your key fab suppliers and the company. How did you kind of turn that into where they were on board with something much more dynamic and flexible and didn't feel like they were coming out the losers?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we studied in depth with, let's say for our contract manufacturer, right, what product we build and what color, what variation of the product we build, it didn't matter for them. It's what mattered is okay, all the material that we need to buy, so the liability of those materials. So that is something we absorbed it. And having all this material positioned and available when we have to build, and the decision what to build is the last minute decision, just in 1 week out. And the what we procure and buy and everything, that's the 6 to 13 weeks out decisions where we are buying the material, which is typically a low cost material, plastics and everything that goes with our memory. And we buy sufficiently and we buffer differently than our memory products. And then we agree upon certain capacity with the CMs as long as we load the products within the certain limits, certain variation of that volume. It's a win-win situation.
Okay. Let's go on to the next slide. Just to quickly recap, we've obviously talked about quite a number of these things. Metrics are a shared thing that are imbalanced, and they don't fragment into localized metrics on the way down. But there's also a lot of bottoms-up stuff that you do to make sure that the individuals who are making up your initiative are properly skilled, properly oriented, properly motivated, and move forward. But if you really want a recap of what it takes and what the ingredients are on the table to successfully do what I would consider big things, Lora Cecere's got my favorite slide of all time that is really probably the best recap of what happens when you do or don't have all the right ingredients. So Laura, take us all the way home.
Well, I actually stole this slide in 1994. I saw it with Procter & Gamble presentation, really looking at demand and working on partners and using demand data. And one of the leaders of Procter & Gamble got up at an ECR conference in Europe and said, you know, I want to really admit that we have done this the wrong way, that we have gone to market trying to work with our channel partners, but not really putting the right stuff in place. And it's based on the Cotter model of change management that says that you've got to have a shared vision, you've got to have the right skills, you've got to have the right incentives, you've got to have the right resources, you've got to have a consistent plan, and you've got to have aligned leadership. And he said, so many times we would start initiatives and we wouldn't bring the right stuff to market. So we might be missing a shared vision and we would cause confusion, or we might not have the right skills. Maybe people would come in and out of jobs and we would cause anxiety, or maybe we didn't have a common plan and so we'd have a lot of false starts. And I actually see that that is probably the biggest issue in the market, is we have a lot of false starts, that, you know, we have a lot of well-intended commercial teams that want to work with the channel, but they don't really understand this thing, supply chain, and so they don't really embrace planning in the holistic way that we're talking about the SanDisk does. And then we might not have the right resources, you know, and one of the issues is the supply chain teams tend to reward the urgent. And this is important work. This is planning. And so, you know, we can't knee-jerk. We can't always be about chasing the order we didn't make on the truck yesterday. And then the really important piece that I think we were talking about here from SanDisk is aligned incentives all the way through sell-through. And when we can align, and I give a lot of kudos to the CEO vision to change those commercial incentives, when we can align all the way to the shelf and we can take the value network across the commercial teams to really focus on sell-through and delivery to the end consumer, we win with demand-driven. And this is one of my favorite slides, too, but I want to be sure I give the right attribution. It was a Procter & Gamble slide, and I thought it was really great that he talked in the 1990s about the missed opportunities. Now, if we take this now to 2015, I think that many companies could put up the same slide, and they have very few examples of really driving long-term impactful change because of the lack of alignment between the functions and because of the focus on functional and project-based approaches. Right. And I think that's really very core to the DNA we're talking about here.
I do too. As consultants, we walk in and we can very frequently, if we would have this slide, just say, how many of these boxes can you check with what you're talking to me about? And routinely, it comes up short, including when they're talking about strategic change. The other thing that happens, though, is that they don't even get to this point. They compartmentalize what they're trying to do, and they don't even try to articulate, where am I going with my company? I just want it to be better than it is today. So we need to wrap here. I think we've talked about how demand-driven is truly a profound strategic thing, and you can't pigeonhole it or minimize it or localize it. It's very organizationally impactful, and it impacts individuals as well. And if you don't address those things, they can derail your efforts to take it completely off track. So we've talked about some of the things that are important to mitigate or get in front of that. But at the end of the day, a strategy has to exist, and it has to be clearly linked to the tactical details and to the factors that really influence the organizational and individual behavior. And this can be some hard conversations to have in some companies and some cultures. But the benefits of what you're looking for are not easily attained, and there's always the chance that your competitor is doing this and taking it more seriously than you are. So that kind of wraps our discussion for today. And Shiva, thank you so much for sharing the SanDisk story. And Laura, thank you so much for bringing your perspective, which is highly respected. And we've really enjoyed this. We think that the work is not in the theory. The work is in really understanding how impactful it is and how it affects human beings.
Thank you.
So thank you, everyone, for joining the webinar today. I want to personally thank Laura, Shiva, and John for sharing so openly and being so real in this conversation. The slides will be available online through our LinkedIn group and also on the website, spinnakermgmt.com. And you'll get a follow-up email from the conference service. And thank you for joining and giving you the opportunity for additional questions and information. That concludes our joint webinar today. and have a great day. Thank you.